My name is Silje Ljosland Bakke. I work for a Norwegian organization called Nasjonal IKT, which is owned by the public hospital sector of Norway and is tasked with getting the same public hospitals to work together, which is very challenging. It's a bit like trying to raise your own parents. But we do a lot of standardization work and also a lot of common projects with the hospitals. And I have one slide on what we're doing in Norway. I'm not going to go into that, but if you go and look at the slides later, you can look at that yourselves. Initially, I'm going to talk about pragmatic standardization. And a lot of people will ask, isn't standardization by its nature unpragmatic? Do those words even fit together in the same sentence, pragmatic and standardization? And what we think is that maybe we can make standardization less dogmatic by applying some simple reality checks to it. And this is what this talk is about. Because modeling the clinical world is very difficult. There's a lot of information, so much stuff, both in width and in depth, and a lot of it is really, really complicated. And it changes all the time. So how do you do that? So we made some principles for this modeling, and that we're trying our best to follow. Firstly, we need clinicians to define the clinical models, because if technical people do it, they will have to interpret what the clinicians are telling them, which means that in a lot of cases they will not end up with what the clinicians actually meant. Also, healthcare changes all the time. Every day there's published thousands of new papers within the healthcare sciences. And a lot of those leads to changes in clinical practice, which means that information models will have to change. So we'll have to be able to change information model as healthcare changes. Additionally, model content must be predictable, so we need to govern this tightly. We know that vendors and solutions come and go. If you look into other sectors like spreadsheets, how many people are using Lotus 123? Now, if you were in the 80s or 90s, everyone would raise their hand, but now everyone is using Excel, and a lot of people haven't heard of Lotus. So, and the same thing is happening and will happen within the healthcare information sector as well. So models must be independent of vendors. Also, we've learned, at least, that clinical modeling is difficult and it's very expensive to do. So we have to do it once and then share the models freely. Again, persistence and exchange have to be based on the same models, because we want to be able to exchange the information without having to map too much stuff. So we have to make the models suitable for a variety of use cases and not just one or the other. And this requires an approach to standardization that is pragmatic, which means that there's no way we could do this with the traditional ways of doing standardization work, because traditionally you'd make a standard document, you'd get it reviewed and probably improved a bit, and then there'd be ballots in ISO, whichever SDO you're working with. Then you'd wait 5 years and then make a revision. And because of the scope here is enormous, we can't really make a standard containing everything, because before we start using it. So we need a way to slice the problem into bite-sized chunks before that we all can agree on, and then start reusing right away. And then requirements will inevitably change, and we'll need to change the standards too. So we'll need to be able to do this right away, not in 5 years, and for each little chunk, not for the whole collection of things. And for this, we'll need to be able to track versions and history and etc. of each little chunk of information. And again, because the scope is so big, we need to select our battles carefully, because some things should definitely be standardized, while others would only get us headaches and very little actual gain if we try to standardize them. And finally, we have to realize that some standardization is much, much better than none. This is the basic, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, and so on. And then we go on to clinical engagement, which I guess a lot of you will know that is clinical engagement is difficult because the clinicians are busy treating patients, and you don't want to take them away from that more than absolutely necessary. And again, traditionally, you'd have to get clinicians out of their clinics, wards, labs, operating theaters, etc., for whole days, send them by plane or train to a meeting in another city. And then you put them all in a meeting room with food and drinks and tell them to agree on something and lock the door and wait for the white smoke. And this is so expensive, and it doesn't lead to the results that you want. For those of you who have attended standardization meetings, this is one of the things that usually happens. Many of the people in the standardization meeting won't know why they've been sent there, and they will get really bored and maybe even fall asleep. And then there'll always be those two people who can't agree on some detail or other and spend most of the meeting arguing about it. So how do you get clinicians engaged in standardization of clinical information? And one major issue is making models that clinicians intuitively understand and identify with. To achieve this, models have to be oriented around clinical concepts, not, for example, database schemas. Technical details should be hidden or translated into human language. And then you need good tools that facilitate participation. This should be online, and it should be asynchronous. No meetings, or at least no all-day meetings with traveling involved. And if someone needs to travel, it should be the techies and not the clinicians. Next, give clinicians something back for their effort, something that actually affects their daily work in a positive way, and not just the CEO of the hospital. And this could, for example, be help with improving quality of care, or it could be functionality that helps them spend less, not more, definitely not more time on information entry. As you probably know, a lot of new IT solutions in healthcare will lead to more data entry and not less, and this is something we really should try our best to avoid. Finally, there needs to be a short time frame from engagement to result, and it has to be a result. If you don't give them a result, you lose your clinicians forever. So on to the pragmatic standardization. How much should we actually standardize, and how do we make the selection? I don't know if you can read this, but these are two models about hepatitis C status, and the other one is medication management. And they're obviously very different in size and complexity, but they're also different with regard to whether they should be standardized. One should definitely be standardized because it's used everywhere, and the other one is probably more a local use case. So how do you make this choice? What we've found is that only information that is to be reused or shared has to be standardized. If the information is only relevant within its original context, the definition can just as well be local to that context. But widespread reuse or sharing within a single solution is at least as important as exchange, and is also difficult to achieve. And here you might say, why standardize if reuse is only within one system? If you consider a large hospital EHR, which has like 100,000 database tables, will you be able to achieve effective reuse within that application unless you enforce pragmatic standardization of information models across that solution? I don't think you would. 100,000 tables or anything close to that is far too much for anyone to have an overview of. And you would end up with multiple definitions of the same information within the same solution, which effectively hinders reuse. So we've formulated 3 questions that we try to ask ourselves whenever we want to decide whether to, or need to decide whether to standardize something or not. The first one is, what is the purpose of the information? What is the concept? Can it be generalized? What is its context? The second one is, will you reuse that information in a structured way at all? And if not, why not use free text? The third one is, will you reuse this information in other places than where it was originally recorded? And if you don't want to do that or don't need to do that, why not just make it a local definition? And I have an example of this, which is the Cancer Registry of Norway, from the reporting of colorectal cancers, where we have this form that's currently filled out manually, although online by clinicians, about the registration, investigation, of the cancer. And the screenshots here are in Norwegian, but there should be enough medical Latin in it to be enable you to get the gist of it. The information here is the localization of a primary tumor, so if you can read that, you know Norwegian. Localization, these are ICD-10 codes. And there's a specific localization, and there's information about the diagnostic certainty at the date of confirmation, and the context is cancer investigation and treatment. And this information will be reused within its context for clinical and registry purposes, but it will also be reused outside its context for decision support, analytics, reimbursement, etc. So the answer to this, for this data this should be definitely be standardized. The second one, if you've ever worked with cancer information, you'd recognize this as the TNM classification. TNM is a classification based on the information about the main tumor, the local lymph nodes, and the remote metastases of the cancer. So this is the part about the primary tumor, the T, and it's the 6th edition of TNM classification in colon cancer, and the context here is cancer investigation and treatment, again the same as the other one. Reuse here will be within context for clinical and registry purposes, and it may also be reused outside of this context, but we don't know for sure. So our answer for this would be, if you have the time to do it within your project, please do. But if you run out of time, this is something that you can skip standardization of. And then there's this one. This information is pretty obscure. There are very registry-specific questions about lymph node metastases. There are no standardized codes for these things, and they're phrased as a questionnaire. It's very difficult to generalize this information, and it will be used for the registry, but probably not for clinical practice. And it will probably not be reused outside of the registry context because it's so specific. So this is one of the places where I'd say choose your battles when you come up against something like this. Then, if you choose to make a local definition, it's worth pointing out that local information definitions can be used in several different solutions or functionalities, as long as those solutions all will work within the same context. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're locking the information into only one functionality. So this is a very common occurrence. You want to standardize, but you run out of time. Projects don't have time to wait, and usually underestimate the time it takes to go through the standardization process. So since it will happen, it's a good idea to have a plan about how to handle it. First of all, agreement on basic modeling patterns means that it will be much easier to reconcile data between the draft information model and the final published ones. Secondly, agreeing that the draft models will be named or tagged in a certain way, for example, with a prefix or postfix in its ID, makes it much easier to tell which of the two was used to store which data. And thirdly, try not to underestimate the time it takes to standardize next time. And starting modeling work as soon as you have the information requirements is generally a good idea, and this should be very early in every project, is our experience. And finally, this is a slide I use in every single presentations I do, no matter topic of the presentation. Structuring information is not in itself a goal. You structure information because you want to gain some value from that structured information. It's difficult and expensive to do, and it's often more cumbersome for users, and it can lead to loss of important nuances in the information gathered. So structuring should be done when it has clear value for clinical use, for registries, research purposes, for necessary reporting, or if in some cases it actually makes recording information easier. And then, of course, it's a no-brainer. And remember that it should always be possible to add nuance to structured information using free text. And in some cases, free text is adequate and maybe even a better choice. Thanks for listening.